Hi, I'm Wyatt Cash with Scoop News Group, and here to talk about why privileged access is a distinct part of the zero trust equation and offer some insights on implementing scalable solutions effectively are Des Powley, Head of Global Managed Services at CyberArk, and Naresh Persaud, Managing Director, Cyber Risk Services at Deloitte. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Hi, Wyatt. It's great to be here.
Hey, Wyatt, great. Thanks for having me.
Well, the ability to restrict access to valuable resources, whether it's the government's nuclear codes or an organization's proprietary data, is certainly not new. However, Des, let me start with you. How should organizations think about managing privileged access differently from identity management? And what makes privileged access distinct from identity and authentication management in general?
Well, that's a great question. Thanks, Wyatt. So privileged access is required because it really addresses a key area of the IT landscape that has been overlooked or can be overlooked by organizations, which is looking at those system accounts, those highly entitled administrator accounts, shared accounts for specific tasks within an organization, or in many cases, temporary accounts that are required, or what we like to call ephemeral access accounts, where privileged access is granted and then revoked for a period of time to do specific tasks. This is important because these accounts tend to have very high levels of access to very sensitive and critical data, and that needs to be audited, monitored, and managed on a consistent and a continuous basis. And beyond that, these accounts have traditionally been anonymous accounts or shared accounts, test accounts, administrator accounts, where the user is the administrator or the root level account. It's not a human being, it's not a real person. So we want to be able to tie those shared anonymous accounts to real people so that real people can be held accountable for their actions, and also real people can be protected if somebody else has done something wrong. And we need to look at that in a very distinct, multidimensional way, because this isn't just about IT anymore. This is about people. It's about things that have high levels of access. And it's also about the dynamic nature of the new generation of digital economy that looks at containerized access, looks at dynamic application access, looks at the desktop, the server, looks at all aspects of IT as it transforms and the way that it drives the business forward today.
Well, Naresh, why is it proving to be such a challenge for organizations and the public sector, perhaps in particular, to implement privileged access controls?
Well, Wyatt, there are probably a few reasons we're seeing this today. Number one, I would say, is access to talent. Right now, there is an unprecedented demand for resources with the right level of skills, competency that understand privileged access management, but even more so, understand how to do privileged access at scale. So organizations are finding hard to tap talent, and it's hard to create all of that talent with the right experience. At the same time, if you look at, these organizations are competing for talent with lots of tech companies, et cetera, which makes it complicated. But even at the state level and even at the federal level, you're seeing a vast number of, public servants retiring, which causes a real gap in the market, and getting the right skills to fill that gap is challenging. The second reason here is organizations, doing it at scale requires that organizations build in the capability for organizational change management. I think one thing to take into account is that when you're an administrator today and you're using, highly privileged accounts, it requires some changing in behavior to apply practices to build in change management, and that's something that requires, in terms of implementation and operating at scale, it requires putting some process in place and changing some processes. The other thing that's making it difficult is that the scope of it is much larger. To build on what Des said, is that the volume of service accounts is just proliferating. And what was not only is it privileged access management, it's permissions management and ephemeral access. And so I think the scope of what organizations are trying to get their handle on has sort of increased underneath them over time. And as a result, like being able to do it at scale has become really critical.
Well, I know we often think of privileged access as a series of control gates applied to users, but there's a much wider circle of people who also depend on privileged access audits and controls, et cetera. Tell us a little more about who are these additional stakeholders here, and why is having a modern and scalable solution perhaps even more important than it used to be?
Well, I think, as Naresh touched on, there is a volume element here, and there's a contextual element. Anybody can be a privileged user, given the context of what they're looking at. If an organization is preparing its annual report, the person who is doing the numbers in the annual report has privileged access at that particular time, and privileged access to very sensitive data that can change markets, can change the way that organizations run. In the government sector, this could be access to policy, it could be access to personal critical data or citizen data or child benefit data or child welfare information. So the stakeholders then become the custodians of that data and the people that care about how that data and that information is used. And that's why the importance of privileged access and controlling and managing and monitoring it is driving to the fore. So we see a much wider spread. It's not an IT problem anymore. It's a true business or organization level issue. And understanding that contextual element, because maybe the person who's putting the data together to go into a child welfare document only has that access for a short period of time, but for that short period of time, they need to be audited and controlled as a privileged user and a highly entitled user.
Naresh, your additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think Des hit on a very important point there, which is, and this is important to us, is that oftentimes organizations are not thinking about the broader set of stakeholders in the enterprise. It's important to remember that, that privileged access is not just technology, it's also sort of the processes and things we put behind it. And when you think about it today, it's the organization change management. When you think about it today, it's how do the audit teams access that information? Organizations that are very successful at this take privileged access and turn it into a service-oriented capability that they can scalably deploy across the organization. If you're a state government, you're not going to deploy it once. You're going to bring on multiple agencies and have them consume the technology. And you have to think about a predictable, repeatable process to do that. If you deploy it and you have a few servers on it, but you can't safely, vault all the service accounts for the applications and work with application owners to do that, you're not successful, right? Part of this is turning it into a service-oriented, organization change management driven process that you can scale. And I think that's critical. The other thing to, and so that gives you a whole set of stakeholders, audit organizations, application owners that you have to embrace. The second part of this is also, the increasing DevOps and DevSecOps organizations. Every organization that's transforming digitally is building that transformation, and they're employing people who are using continuous delivery tools, continuous integration tools, and developers who don't know how to build access into the technologies that they're putting in place. And so that stakeholder group is becoming increasingly important. And so when we think about it, it's the evolving service-oriented architecture of privileged access is what's driving or at least shaping the adoption in organizations.
It's an interesting spectrum of users, really. Thank you for sharing that. Lastly, let me ask, so what do you see as the essential steps that organizations need to take to operationalize modern privileged access platforms and really have them be able to scale to meet future demands? Des, maybe you could start with that.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Wyatt. So I think from a CyberArk perspective, we have a blueprint and a portfolio of technology that we want to help organizations to address this. The proliferation of privileged access and the contextual nature of that ephemeral access that Naresh mentioned means that we need to look at what the highest criticality is, the most sensitive piece, and start with that and build out this blueprint or this roadmap for how we address that, starting with um, the things that need to be addressed immediately, and then driving forward to look at how digital transformation or other strategic demands that the organization may place are going to drive forward. I think the first thing that we have to look at is that this is primarily about security, but it's also about operational efficiency. It's also about, as Naresh mentioned, this talent gap, this talent crunch of millions of unfilled cybersecurity roles out there. So working with key partners like CyberArk, working with Deloitte to build out a capability and helping our organizations to consume the technology, both as a technology service in terms of a software as a service capability, but also to work with organizations that can help you see the value out of that and drive it forward, hitting those most sensitive and critical elements first and working that through, whether that's looking at system accounts and entitlements at the IT level, and then working through the operating technology into the digital transformation and the DevSecOps areas, or whether it's starting at the desktop and looking at whether or not ransomware or drive-by threats at the desktop level are an issue that need to be addressed with potentially a non-security or threat-aware user demographic. So, to summarize that, I think that we believe that working with experts and highly capable organizations such as Deloitte with the right technology, such as CyberArk and the portfolio to address all elements of the technology stack are important to us. And potentially looking at that as a managed service or a managed security service is something that we think is of high value to organizations.
And Naresh, what might you add on that as well?
Yeah, and I mean, just to build on what Des just said, we think it is about getting the right operating model, because if you don't put that model in place so people can consume it, they don't use it, right? So I think putting an operating model that makes it predictable and repeatable for people, how they request access, how it's fulfilled, how do they get certain roles, how do you rotate passwords, and all of those things on a regular basis, right? When we make it easy, people use it more. When we make it difficult, people circumvent security, right? And so making it easy is the right answer. So I think if you evolve the operating model to include technology management, patching, upgrades, enhancements, and make those easy, how do you scale and add new capabilities, endpoint protection, all of those things as you need them, is important going forward. And you want to make it, you don't want to adopt technologies that are 5 versions behind the main release, right? Like, you really want to keep those kind of up to date. Des's perspective that, we think managed services is a way to help people get better outcomes, especially when they can't find the talent, or they don't have time to organically evolve their own operating model. The other thing that we emphasize is a maturity model, which is, and that helps you build a roadmap, because the world is not stagnant. If you're putting this capability in, you're putting it in for business reasons. The business is transforming, they're changing, they're adopting different technologies. And that maturity model can be a guideline and your North Star for how you evolve your service. I think that, I can't emphasize this part enough. Strong organization change management, because so much of security is dependent on behavior, and adopting new security technologies means changing behavior and getting people to see why this is valuable. Your administrators might not like giving up power, but when they find out that as a result, they probably get blamed less for things that go wrong, all of a sudden, they see the value in it, and making people see the value in it, why it's important to them and how it makes their job better, is a critical part of driving change.
Well, those are some great points. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for shedding some fresh perspectives on ways to think about and implementing privileged access inside public sector organizations more effectively. Really appreciate your being here.
Thanks, Wyatt.
Thanks, Will.